I never thought I would have to face another battle right on my own driveway, but life always has unexpected surprises. This time, my opponent wasn't the HOA, it was my neighbor, Mrs. Emily Johnson. Welcome to Karen Chronicles. Before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue creating even better content. Thank you so much. All right, let's get started. The mysterious marks. It all started when I began noticing strange marks on my driveway. Scratches appeared on the pavement, sometimes tire marks, other times tiny footprints. At first, I thought it might have been caused by cars or weather conditions. But then, one morning, as I stepped outside to grab the newspaper, I saw it with my own eyes. From across the street, two children, a boy and a girl, ran straight across my driveway without hesitation, as if it belonged to them. Right after that, a teenage boy zoomed through on a bicycle, his tires skidding hard against the pavement, leaving a long black streak. I stood there stunned, trying to process what was happening. Then I noticed Mrs. Emily's backyard gate wide open. These kids weren't just wandering onto my property by accident, they were using my driveway as a shortcut. Observing the pattern. Over the next few days, I decided to watch more closely. Every morning before leaving for work, I glanced out the window, and the same thing kept happening. Emily's kids ran across my driveway as if it were their personal walkway. Sometimes they laughed and yelled right outside my front door. One day, I even saw one of the kids drop their scooter on my driveway and leave it there for over an hour. The breaking point. Then came the worst part. My car was scratched. A long scratch on the side of my vehicle, clearly caused by something hard scraping against it. This was no accident. One of those kids had done this. I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was time to talk to Mrs. Emily Johnson. The confrontation. Mrs. Emily was a middle-aged woman who always carried herself with a sense of politeness, but also arrogance. I knocked on her door, and when she opened it, I kept my tone as calm as possible. "Good morning, Mrs. Emily. I'd like to discuss something about my driveway." She tilted her head, pretending not to understand. "Oh, what's the matter?" "I've noticed that your kids frequently run across my driveway, and sometimes they even ride their bikes there. I'm concerned because this could lead to property damage. In fact, my car has already been scratched." I expected an apology, or at least a reasonable response. But instead, Mrs. Emily smirked and crossed her arms. "Oh, I think you're overreacting. They're just kids playing. It's not a big deal." I clenched my jaw, trying to stay composed. "I understand, but my driveway is not a public playground. I'm asking you to tell them to stop using it as a shortcut." That's when her entire demeanor changed. Her face turned cold and her voice became firm. "It seems like you haven't read the HOA rules carefully. Driveways are not entirely private property. According to HOA regulations, driveways are classified as semi-public areas, meaning residents have the right to use them when necessary." I froze. "Are you saying my driveway belongs to the community?" Exactly. "If you have a problem with it, bring it up at the HOA meeting. But I wouldn't waste my time. It's already written in the rules." I clenched my fists. She knew exactly what she was doing, exploiting an HOA loophole to justify this behavior. And I knew this battle had only just begun. I thought this issue would only involve negotiating with my neighbor, but I was completely wrong. This escalated much faster than I expected. And this time Karen was back. The HOA strikes again. Just 2 days after my conversation with Mrs. Emily Johnson, I received a letter from the HOA. It was printed on official letterhead and the tone was clearly threatening. We have received a complaint that your driveway is being used in violation of community regulations. According to HOA bylaws, driveways cannot be considered exclusively private property, and allowing or encouraging uncontrolled usage could negatively impact neighborhood safety and planning. If this issue is not resolved immediately, the HOA reserves the right to impose financial penalties, including a fine of up to $800 for us, along with additional enforcement measures if necessary. I couldn't believe my eyes. They were claiming that I was allowing my neighbors to use my driveway. I never did that. I had specifically asked Mrs. Emily to stop, and now I was the one being blamed. At the bottom of the letter, I saw a familiar name, Karen Mitchell, head of the HOA board court. Of course, Karen was pulling the strings again. I wasn't going to let this slide. The very next day, I went straight to the HOA office to confront her in person. She was sitting behind her desk, arms crossed, wearing that same smug smile I had seen before. "Oh, you got here fast," she said, her tone dripping with mockery. I slammed the letter down on the desk. "Karen, what is this? I never allowed anyone to use my driveway." Karen blinked, pretending to be surprised. "Oh, but we received reports that your neighbors use it every day. If you didn't allow it, then why is it still happening?" I clenched my teeth. I told them to stop, but they refused. And now, after this HOA letter, they're using it even more. Kim irked and lightly tapped her fingers on the desk. "Then maybe you should reconsider how you handle the situation. If your driveway is causing disruptions in the community, the HOA has the right to impose additional regulations." I stared her down. "Then why didn't you send a warning letter to Mrs. Emily Johnson? If my driveway is semi-public, then why am I the only one getting fined?" Karen shrugged, but I saw the sharp glint in her eyes. "You should be careful with how you phrase your questions. If you don't want the HOA to get even more involved, I suggest you cooperate." I gritted my teeth. She wasn't just protecting Mrs. Emily, she was actively turning me into the problem. Things get worse. Just as I feared, this only made things worse. Emily's kids ran across my driveway daily, treating it like a public road. The noise grew louder, bikes skidding, children yelling, even in the evening. Teenagers began gathering on my driveway, laughing and intentionally making noise. I knew what was happening. Karen had encouraged them. By sending that letter blaming me, she had sent a clear message. His driveway belongs to everyone. Keep using it. And now it wasn't just Emily's family. More and more neighbors started acting like my driveway was community space. The breaking point. One evening, I stood at the edge of my driveway, watching kids running across it, tire marks multiplying, scratches deepening on the pavement that I had personally paid to maintain. I couldn't let this continue. I knew that if I didn't act now, Karen and the HOA would keep pushing me into a weaker position, twisting every rule in their favor. I had taken down Karen once before, and if she wanted to play this game again, I wasn't going to hold back. This battle had just begun. I knew that if I just sat back and endured this, the HOA and Karen would keep crushing me with absurd regulations. So I decided to fight back. But this time, I wasn't just going to stop my neighbors from abusing my driveway. I was going to expose Karen's entire scheme and end her reign of power once and for all. Digging for the truth. For several nights, I pored over the HOA bylaws, reading every single page, the same rules that Karen used to intimidate and control the residents. And that's when I found something suspicious. Driveways are not community property. According to the original HOA regulations, driveways still belonged to the homeowner. The so-called semi-public clause only applied in specific emergency situations, such as when an ambulance or utility vehicle needed access. Nowhere did it state that the HOA could force homeowners to allow other residents to use their driveway as a shortcut. So why was Karen exploiting this clause to make my driveway public? I dug deeper, and then I found something even bigger. The HOA board can only impose fines with a majority vote. But here's the problem. Karen controlled almost the entire board. Gathering evidence. I knew that just citing one rule wouldn't be enough. I needed proof that Karen was abusing her power. So I started talking to my neighbors, especially those who had lived here for years, and what I uncovered made my blood boil. One family was forced to repaint their front door because the color was non-compliant, even though it had been pre-approved. An elderly resident was fined for overgrown grass, but when he contested it, the HOA suddenly changed the rule. Another family had trouble renewing their lease, not because of legal reasons, but because Karen didn't like them. The more I listened, the clearer the picture became. Karen wasn't just a control freak, she had been manipulating the HOA for years. The HOA meeting, Karen's trap. 1 week later, the HOA scheduled a meeting to resolve the driveway issue. I knew this was Karen's trap. She planned to use this meeting to formally impose penalties on me, but I was ready. When I walked into the meeting room, Karen was seated at the head of the table, smiling smugly. "Welcome, everyone," she began, her voice dripping with authority. "Today, we will address an important issue. Some residents are failing to comply with HOA regulations and disrupting the community." Then she turned to me. "We have received multiple complaints that you are preventing residents from using your driveway. This could be a violation of community rules." I raised an eyebrow. "Karen, I haven't stopped anyone. I just want to protect my property from being misused." She smirked. "It seems you don't understand. The HOA has the authority to regulate driveway usage if necessary. So if other residents have concerns about how you use your driveway, we can take action." I didn't let her control the meeting. I pulled out my documents and placed them on the table. According to the official HOA bylaws, driveways remain private property, except in emergency situations. So Karen, can you explain why the HOA is forcing me to let my neighbors use it as a walkway? Silence. But she tried to keep her composure. "That's a rule we've enforced for years. You can't just change it because it's inconvenient for you." I chuckled coldly and pulled out another stack of papers. "Interesting, because I've spoken to multiple residents, and it turns out I'm not the only one the HOA has unfairly targeted. This is a list of homeowners who have been wrongfully fined, nearly all of them directly tied to decisions you made." Suddenly lost her cool. "You're making this up to attack me," she snapped. I played my final card. "Then maybe you can explain why certain HOA expenses are unaccounted for, and why the HOA fines collected from residents have no clear financial report? The room, is that true? Where has our HOA money been going? We need an immediate financial audit." Karen panicked. She started shouting, denying everything, trying to change the subject. But this time, no one believed her. The beginning of the end. I knew right then and there, Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her life, and I wasn't stopping here. Karen was used to controlling everything in the HOA, but this time she was losing her grip. After I exposed her at the HOA meeting, she could no longer manipulate residents like before. For the first time in years, people started questioning her decisions, questioning the money the HOA collected without clear explanations. She couldn't win by controlling the HOA anymore, so she got dirtier. 2 days after the HOA meeting, as I was at home, a police car suddenly pulled up in front of my house. I looked out the window, and there she was, Karen, arms crossed, eyes filled with triumph, standing behind the officers as they walked toward my door. A knock. I took a deep breath, kept my composure, and opened the door. "Good afternoon, sir. We received a report about a hazardous obstruction on your driveway, something that could be blocking traffic and causing potential accidents." I frowned. "A hazardous obstruction?" Karen immediately stepped forward, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Yes, I've warned him so many times. His driveway is unsafe. Cars could skid, children could trip, and someone could get seriously injured if they accidentally crash into it. I've tried reasoning with him, but he ignores everything. I had no choice but to call the police to step in." I clenched my fists. She was trying to frame me as a safety hazard on my own driveway. I didn't panic. I simply stepped outside and pointed to the security camera mounted on my roof. "Before you do anything, officers, I'd like to show you some evidence." I pulled out my phone, played the recorded footage from my security camera. No hazardous obstruction. My driveway was completely clear. No barriers, no hazards, no accidents. I held up my phone to the officers. "Do you see any obstructions here?" The officers watched closely. Then they turned to Karen. Silence. Karen's face shifted. But she still tried to push her lie. But he must have removed it before you arrived. I saw it with my own eyes, I swear." One of the officers crossed his arms, his tone turning serious. "Do you have any evidence of that, ma'am? Photos? Videos? Any witnesses?" Karen stuttered. She had nothing. The officer shook his head. Ma'am, based on what we see here, there is no violation. There's no reason for us to get involved. Karen's face went pale. Karen's biggest mistake yet. By now, several neighbors had gathered outside watching everything unfold. Some were standing on their lawns, some whispering amongst themselves. I spotted Mrs. Emily Johnson nearby, and for the first time, she wasn't looking smug. Karen had made a critical mistake. She had called the police over a completely fabricated complaint and got caught in front of the entire neighborhood. I turned to her, my voice calm but full of meaning. You're abusing your power again, Karen, and now everyone is finally seeing it. She pressed her lips together, so furious she couldn't even speak. As the police left, I overheard whispers among the neighbors, she's gone too far this time. Why would she make something like that up? If she lied about this, what else has she been lying about? Karen stormed off, her face tense, but I knew she was feeling the pressure. The HOA was starting to turn against her. As I stepped back inside my house, I felt it, a shift in the air. Karen had overplayed her hand. She wasn't in full control anymore. People were starting to realize the truth, and I knew I was getting closer to my final victory. After Karen was exposed in front of the police, everything changed. Before, the HOA had been her tool of power, something she could manipulate at will. But now, the entire neighborhood saw the truth. She no longer controlled everyone. The emergency HOA meeting. Right after the incident with the police, an emergency HOA meeting was called. Unlike before, Karen was no longer the center of attention. Instead, residents started questioning the HOA itself. I came prepared with a full list of unjust HOA decisions made under Karen's control. Unreasonable fines, like how I was fined just for my own HOA despite no official rule allowing it. Bias and abuse of power. Karen only used the HOA to benefit those who supported her while punishing those who opposed her. Lack of financial transparency. The HOA collected fees from residents, but no one actually knew where the money was going. Residents grew furious. We've been paying HOA fees for what? Just to get unfair fines? How can we trust an organization where we don't even have a real say? We need to change how the HOA operates. Karen tried to take control. She stood up, raising her hands to call for order. Everyone, please calm down. We must follow HOA regulations to maintain order in our community. Without the HOA, this neighborhood would fall into chaos. But no one was listening anymore. I stood up, looking Karen directly in the eye. No one is against having an HOA. What we're against is an HOA being manipulated by one person for personal gain. Silence. Karen had nothing left to say. She knew she had lost control. The community strikes back. 1 week after the meeting, something unexpected happened. Residents began signing a petition demanding HOA reforms. They demanded financial transparency. All HOA revenue and expenses must be publicly disclosed so residents know where their money goes. Fair voting rights. Major HOA decisions must be voted on by residents, preventing a small group from holding absolute power. Limited HOA authority. The HOA could no longer fine residents arbitrarily without a clear appeals process. Karen was completely powerless. Before, she could silence any opposition, but now residents had united against her. Even Mrs. Emily Johnson, who once opposed me, stayed quiet. She had realized Karen was no longer the strongest force in the community. Karen's fall, with no other choice, Karen was forced to step down. Karen was removed from power. She had lost all trust and could no longer lead the HOA. A new election was held. This time, residents had a real voice in choosing who ran the HOA. Ridiculous rules were repealed. Driveways were no longer considered shared property, and other unfair policies were eliminated. After years of controlling the HOA, Karen lost everything. She left the meeting in silence. No applause, no support, nothing. The next morning, I stood on my driveway and took a deep breath. No one ran across my driveway anymore. No more yelling, no more screeching tires. No more HOA warning letters, no more police knocking on my door. I hadn't just taken back my driveway, I, along with my community, had taken back our entire neighborhood. The story of the HOA was never just a dispute over a driveway. It became a symbol of the battle between authoritarian power and the strength of community unity. We have all witnessed or experienced similar situations in life, where an individual or a small group abuses power, enforces irrational rules, and manipulates others to maintain control. They rely on silence and fear to sustain their dominance. But this story proves no one can hold power forever if the community stands together. 3 key lessons from this story. Knowledge is power. The homeowner didn't win by luck. He spent time researching HOA laws, understanding his rights, and exposing loopholes in the system. When we understand the law and our rights, we cannot be easily manipulated or bullied. Community is the greatest strength. Karen thrived when residents remained silent, but when they stood together, their collective power overturned her control. No single person can stay in power forever if enough people push back. Unity not only protects individual rights, but also creates a fairer community for everyone. Don't let fear stop you from fighting for justice. Many people choose to stay silent in the face of injustice because they fear conflict or retaliation. But if no one speaks up, people like Karen will continue to abuse their power. Courageously standing up doesn't just protect you, it sets a precedent for future generations. Applying this to real life, whether you live in a neighborhood, an organization, or a larger community, remember this: no one has the right to control you unless you allow them to. If you see injustice, research, learn, and seek support from those around you. When people speak up together, change happens. And most importantly, a strong community is one where everyone has a voice.